I feel like a lot of people in the D&D 5e space make very similar videos to one another. Discourse is a near constant fixation of any fandom that has any kind of prominence on YouTube. But in the case of D&D 5th edition in particular, there is one topic that seems to come up repeatedly.
Why does combat in what's supposed to be the most creative game ever made often devolves into a worst version of your average JRPG?
D&D has a complex combat system to allow for complex and deep fights, so why does it often end up being a bit boring?
Hello friends, I'm Ginny D, and I get so nervous running D&D combat because I feel like it's always so boring.
D&D combat, I think, can be really fun, but oftentimes it is monotonous.
And when D&D combat gets complicated, it gets slow. And when it gets slow, it gets boring.
Yeah, a large amount of the energy in the D&D content creation space gets concentrated around discussing the minutiae of why 5th edition's combat is so lackluster. Why it's not fun to run, why it's not fun to play, why it's boring, why it's frustrating. For a game where combat is such an all-encompassing fixation, nobody seems to actually like D&D 5e's combat. But not only do they agree on the problems, they typically also agree on the solutions. Most videos about how or why D&D's combat is flawed point the blame at the speed of play. That is to say, how long each round of combat takes in real time. Or they point at things like the dynamism of the environment. Both of these feel like fairly common sense solutions. If combat is boring, make it go faster and make it take place inside more interesting environments. The solutions then suggested usually come down to adding things like real-life time limits within the span of a round, or introducing interactable elements within the environment, and adding interactable elements on the battle map. The most commonly suggested form of the latter was stuff like adding in differences in elevation, cover, or focusing the combat on completing a set of related objectives rather than just killing all the enemies. Put more simply, they're presenting combat as a problem of how it's being run, or how players are interacting with it, rather than an issue with the core rules themselves. I think this evaluation is ultimately flawed. That's what this video is about, but it's flawed in a way that makes sense. It's, admittedly, a lot more productive to give viewers actionable changes that they can incorporate into their own campaigns than talking about kind of a more abstract game design theory. After all, you can't expect every D&D 5e player to become a game designer. It also makes sense when you consider the fact that a lot of D&D creators are working from a limited frame of reference. Let's be honest with ourselves for a second here. D&D and broader tabletop role-playing are largely two distinct hobbies with two different communities. Most people who play Shadowrun or Pathfinder or World of Darkness or Dark Heresy or Lancer or Powered by the Apocalypse or the godforsaken Cowboy Bebop tabletop role-playing game don't go near D&D if they can help it. And most people who play 5th edition D&D regularly have not ventured beyond its bounds. Maybe they've played a one-shot or two of Pathfinder if they were feeling brave, and this applies to content creators. Someone like a Burger Krieg, who makes videos about Shadowrun and World of Darkness, is probably never going to make a similarly sized lore video about Forgotten Realms. And likewise, we're probably never going to get XP Level 3's How to Play a Hive World Outcast Desperado. So not only are they making these criticisms and suggesting these solutions from a standpoint of immediate applicability over correctness with regards to a more abstract design theory, they're also speaking from a limited frame of reference. That does not mean they're wrong, it simply means their perspective is not the be-all, end-all. I play a lot of RPGs, including 5e when I can stomach it. And I, myself, am literally a game designer. I may primarily work within the realm of tabletop war games, but my start as a tabletop game designer was making my own RPG systems, and I just never ended up actually finishing and releasing any of them. Whoops. So that's what this video is. I want to give my perspective on D&D 5e's combat, informed by the large collection of other games I've played, as well as my own experience making games. We're going to be going point by point and discussing what parts of D&D combat I think missed the mark, but also what games I think do these concepts better. The basic takeaway, however, is this. Combat in 5e isn't bad because the wizard takes too long to figure out what spell they want to use. It's bad because the act of choosing which spell to cast is a fundamentally uninteresting one. And that's not a problem that can necessarily be solved with map objectives or chess timers or any number of other minor house rulings you do to the combat system. 5e's combat is irreparably bad, to such an extent that to actually explain why requires unproductively shitting on the game for about half an hour. And I mean, we're already in front of the bookshelf, right? Most TTRPGs focus on a combat system designed around the following principle. At character creation, you pick a class or background or career or spend XP in such a way that grants you combat abilities. And what you choose to take in character creation determines your role in a fight, whether that be a long-range damage dealer, a close quarters tank, a healer, a support, or some weird hybrid in between. The Game Master then presents the assembled party with combat challenges that force these players to use their collective combat abilities in tandem to solve that challenge. This is the core basis of every party-based RPG combat system. And whether we're talking about Lancers or Lancers, this concept of party dynamics rules over all combat systems. D&D fundamentally breaks this because of one stat: armor class. Armor class in every edition of D&D since 3rd has been a base number plus your dexterity modifier plus an armor value from the armor you're wearing. In 5th edition specifically, wearing heavier armor doesn't grant you a further bonus, it just increases the base number you're then adding your dexterity onto. Your armor class is then the number enemies are rolling against to hit you. Wait, hold on. Your armor class increases based on your dexterity modifier and determines how difficult you are to hit. Does that not seem strange to anyone else?
Let me try to explain with a practical example why this is so weird to me. This is Half Sword. It's a physics-based historical dueling simulator, and it'll help me demonstrate this. We're going to watch a duel together, and I'm going to explain the mechanics of each interaction and how it factors into TTRPG combat design. Right, so the duel starts, he approaches, and I swing directly into his head. I land a hit, but his helmet protected him. He didn't take absolutely no damage, he still got hit in the head with a large metal stick, but the armor he's wearing mitigated the damage. We're circling around each other, I gain some distance, he rushes back in, and I take a step back right as he swings at me. I dodged his attack. I then score another headshot, but again, he's wearing a helmet. But as I swing, he kicks. He misjudges how far he can kick and just kicks empty air. While his leg is still coming down from the kick, I take the opportunity. I hit him, and the tip of my blade finds just the right spot. I give him a nasty cut just under his armpit, and he's down for the count. This duel showcases 3 distinct forms of defense: evasion, mitigation, and inaccuracy. How quickly can you evade attacks? How much damage does the attack do if it lands? Can the opponent actually manage to hit you even if you're standing still? In D&D, all 3 of these forms of defense are folded into one stat, armor class, which goes up based on your armor and dexterity. This means the game functionally treats the attacker missing, the defender dodging, and the attack landing but not dealing damage as entirely identical events. Just as armor class folds all form of defense into itself and thus removing nuance from how you defend, it also means that all forms of attack are folded into just rolling to hit. Counterattacks, feints, the nuanced back and forth of melee combat is here reduced to just slapping the opponent with a stick and seeing if the force of the blow gets through their armor. But all that aside, this also significantly hurts character generation because it functionally removes a major decision point. It strips players of their agency to determine how they want their character's dynamic with damage to take shape. In other games, actually in almost every other game that isn't just using D&D's core rules as a foundation, dodging an attack and soaking the damage from an attack are 2 different sets of mechanics, which gives you, the player, a choice to make. A point during character creation in which you need to make a decision, hence the term decision point, that sets your character on a path that will make them fit a specific playstyle. If you invest fully into dodging, that means you are rarely going to get hit. But woe betide you if you do get hit. And if you invest fully into face tanking damage, you're not going to care about getting hit by most things, but you're going to have basically no way of avoiding anything that can punch through your defenses. But in 5e, this dynamic doesn't exist. Evasion and mitigation are the same mechanic. It's all just armor class. Armor class as a mechanic removes a level of player agency with regards to designing their character. But we can take this concept even further. The way classes are designed in D&D 5e is also fairly problematic for this exact reason. If you open up the 5th edition Player's Handbook, you'll see that each class has what's called a quick build. You can make a paladin quickly by following these suggestions. First, strength should be your highest ability score, followed by charisma. Second, choose the noble background. The reason why this quick build section exists is because classes in 5e are so restrictive and have so few options that you don't actually need to make many decisions at all. Stat allocation is not a meaningful choice because every class is designed to primarily use 1 or 2 stats for everything. Paladins are strength and charisma, monks are dexterity and wisdom, sorcerers are charisma, wizards are intelligence. There are no choices to make with regards to what you make your highest stat because your class chooses for you. Because classes are so singularly designed around only using a limited number of stats, it also makes species selection less interesting. Paladins use strength to hit things with swords and charisma to cast spells, so you've narrowed down your options to races that either buff strength or charisma. Except one race, Dragonborn, gets bonuses to both. Half-elves can also get bonuses to both if you set the stat they get a bonus into strength. Humans either get a flat +1 to every stat, or +1 to 2 stats of your choice and a feat, and thus get bonuses to both. So really, if you're playing a paladin, you're probably playing one of these 3 races. Maybe also tossing in half-orc and mountain dwarf because they get bonuses to strength and constitution. Obviously, the choice exists to play as a halfling or high elf paladin or something like that, but choosing to be less optimal on purpose isn't really a valid decision point from a game design perspective. We as designers should generally assume that if players are presented with a series of options where only a narrow selection of those options are obviously better than the others, our players are going to default to those more optimal choices. This assertion is backed up by evidence, when in 2017, D&D Beyond released statistics showing how many people played which class as which race. The most common pick for Dragonborn, say it with me, was Paladin. The most common pick for Tiefling was Warlock, with Sorcerer, the game's other charisma-based caster, in close second. As much as you may personally insist, "Oh, well, I just play what I think fits best for my character. I don't think about the optimization of my choices ever. You're just a dirty metagamer." The statistics, and also just our understanding of human psychology, says otherwise. Most people are going to subtly gravitate toward whatever choices seem optimal to them that they can stomach using. And with D&D 5e, that gravitation is even more extreme by how binary classes are, and how obvious it makes which choices are the most optimal. But what do I mean when I say that classes are binary? Well, how about we take a look at the level charts for each class? Because we've been using Paladin as the example, we can talk about that. 1, the things you get per level never change across your character. The only choice you make whenever you level up is none, usually. The game just tells you what you get now that you are X level. And these upgrades all fall within a very particular range of a prescribed playstyle. Paladins are frontline hybrid DPS tanks. They have healing abilities and some aura buffing abilities, which might make you think you can run a paladin in more of a support role, but lay on hands requires you to lay your hands on a thing, and you're a primarily melee character. So if you're using it on your allies, it's usually because the fight's pretty much already over, but they got wounded. Otherwise, you're pretty much always using it on yourself when in combat. Beyond that, they get fighting styles, spells, divine smite, extra attacks, subclass features, auras, none of which ever really shake up how you play paladins, but instead just entrenches you deeper within your specific playstyle. Paladins are never given the opportunity to be anything other than frontline bulwarks and damage dealers, with some niche support options. The things you're doing don't change, only the ways you do it. This is a concept known as vertical progression. Your character isn't actually getting deeper, they're just getting better at doing the things they can already do. The numbers go up, but options don't increase. This makes class selection functionally the only meaningful decision point in D&D 5e character creation. Once you pick your class, and once you pick your subclass, you're kinda done making choices. Your race picks itself, your background is pretty much never relevant unless you work it into the roleplay, which, I mean, hey, if you do, good on you, and that's it. From then on, you just get ability score improvements and new ways of doing the things you were already doing. And that's it. From then on, every time you level up, you only get ability score improvements and new ways of doing the things you were already doing right up until level 20. You have one major decision point that then informs the rest of your character. Compare this to the way leveling up works in D&D 4th edition. Put the gun down. In 4th edition, you start with 2 level 1 at-will powers, 1 encounter power, 1 daily power, and 0 utility powers. Then at level 2, you gain a utility power. Then at level 3, you gain a second encounter power, so on and so forth. Each new level, you gain access to more powers and higher level powers as well. And then at 13th level, and every few levels after it, you can replace some of your older, lower level powers with higher level powers. And every class has multiple powers of each type at each level. So you're constantly being confronted with interesting decisions, not just in initial character creation, but for the entire course of a campaign. 4E really is a game where character creation is an active process that never really ends, and the system allows for you to play 4 or 5 or 6 different characters of the same class and have each of them play meaningfully, wildly different. I need to shut up now, because if I go any further, this video will just become 4th edition is cool, y'all are just mean. Good combat in an RPG is, in my estimation, inherently downstream from good character creation. Because Charge N is the part of the game where decisions before combat are made, what class am I, what weapons do I use, what role do I fulfill in the party, these decisions have to be engaging for combat to be engaging. If creating the character doesn't spark interesting decision points, then how is playing them and seeing the outcomes of those decisions supposed to be any more interesting? This also isn't helped by the fact that once you've rolled initiative, the game doesn't have much in the way of interesting choices to make on a per round basis either. But before we get into discussing that, I want to talk about a game that I think gets this concept so right. Lancer is a game with a very similar set of core rules to D&D 5e, and I want to highlight it because it's an example of a game with excellent combat propped up almost entirely by one of the greatest character creation systems I have ever seen in a game. So in Lancer, everything is based on license level. Your license level is a replacement for your character level and represents your combined affinity and favor with the different manufacturing companies that produce the various mechs you're going to be piloting throughout the game. You start at license level 0, and at the end of each mission, your license level goes up by 1. And you invest those license levels in ranks in different mech chassis licenses. By the time you get to license level 2, you can unlock your first custom frame. Or maybe not. The basic GMS Everest frame you start the game with is actually extremely good, because of its ability to make any quick action as a free action once per scene. That means, once per scene, you can shoot all of the weapons on a single mount, or move up to your mech's maximum movement, or any number of things, as a free action on top of all the other actions you're doing on that activation. So if you like the Everest frame, you can just keep investing 1 rank in different licenses every time you rank up. You want the Soul Pattern laser rifle from the Sherman, but then the Monarch's Sharanga missiles? You can do it! Or you can lean into a specific license. Get a unique chassis that has a more prescribed role, but does that role in a unique and interesting way. And then once you have that frame, you can dip future upgrades into the licenses of other frames to get their specific equipment options. You can stick as strictly or as loosely to the defined options of a specific class as much as you want, which in and of itself makes the act of sticking strictly to that role more interesting, because you know that there's the option to not. The license level system manages to create a similar D&D style system of class dynamics where different frames fulfill the different roles more commonly fulfilled by D&D classes, while also letting you dip in and out of them as much as you like. This lets you mix and match to your heart's content in a kind of far less restrictive form of multi-classing. This means that character creation remains dynamic and engaging across the course of a campaign. And this freedom to create extremely diverse builds makes the actual combat so much more fun, because you're seeing the end result of this machine you've been tinkering with. Oh, and it also changed armor class into evasion and has armor be a flat number you reduce all received damage by, because that is how pretty much every game ought to do it. D&D is the only game that does it like this. I have no idea why. In D&D 3.5, there was a huge list of special attack actions you could do in combat. So obviously you could just attack normally, but you could also overrun to try to shoulder check the guy you're in melee with onto the floor to let you move through him into the buddies he's protecting. You could feint, which required you to succeed on an opposed bluff check but made your next attack on that target ignore their dex bonus to AC for the purposes of rolling to hit, representing you faking out your angle of attack to misdirect their guard. You could also do stuff like trip your opponent, specifically target an item they were holding like a weapon or shield. These special attack actions legitimately added a fun layer of strategy and action economy management to melee combat. 5e removed this, a choice that has had consequences. D&D 5e combat is plagued by the fact that once you get within your preferred range, the decision-making functionally stops. More so for martial classes than for spellcasters, but frankly, the problem exists for both. As I explained in the previous section, basically all nuances of melee combat are abstracted into rolling to hit against armor saves. The person getting hit doesn't get to feel like they're at least doing something by getting to roll to dodge, even if they're bad at it. Getting to roll dodges or do out-of-sequence defensive options is a thing a lot of games do to keep players engaged even when it's not their turn. Once you're in melee, nobody wants to leave melee, because they don't want to have to take opportunity attacks. And even then, why would they want to leave melee anyway? If they're a melee character, the only thing they can possibly hope to get by repositioning out of melee is to, get back into melee with a preferred target. You could make the argument that they might want to move out of melee to get on an advantageous piece of terrain, but no, because that's not actually how terrain works. Because for some bizarre reason, 5e doesn't have any modifiers. Well, okay, that's not true. 5e does have one modifier. Advantage. All advantage does is, when you roll to hit, you roll 2d20 and take the highest. Some classes, specifically rogue, interact with advantage in an interesting way because that's how they trigger sneak attacks. But that's also still all they get. Are you fighting an opponent when you have the high ground? Advantage. Is the sun to your backs and in your opponent's eyes? Advantage. The only reward for clever use of terrain or the successful deployment of a stratagem or the surrounding of the enemy, rules as written, is advantage. A thing that you can also get by just, flanking an opponent. A thing that's easy to do if you consider the fact that, once again, nobody wants to leave melee once they're in it. You're basically glued to whatever you're in melee with. Advantage is handed out like candy in combat from things that take no cleverness of tactic or stratagem to actually make use of. So even if you did add elements that were interesting or dynamic to your battle map, why would your players ever actually use them? The actual problem at play here is that when there's only one kind of modifier you can give to a player, any source of that modifier is just as good as any other, so players will default to only using the easiest way to get that modifier. Why would a player take the extra movement or actions or whatever else to engage with a neato piece of terrain or an interactable element you put on the battle map to get advantage when they could instead just have the cleric cast a guiding bolt on their target, or flank their target? Well, if guiding bolt instead of giving advantage on the next attack roll against its target, instead conferred a +2 to that attack roll, while, say, fighting on high ground conferred a +4, then they'll take the extra effort to position themselves on higher ground when the opportunity arises. And they'll also, try to create that opportunity themselves oftentimes. But rules as written both just give the player advantage. They both confer the same benefit, but one is a lot harder than the other. Guiding Bolt's just a first level spell. Compare this to something like, say, Dark Heresy 2nd Edition.
DH2E on page 231 lists a variety of circumstances that grant a variety of modifiers, attacking from higher ground or attacking from short range, both granting a +10 modifier to your ballistic skill or weapons skill roll when rolling to hit. Similarly, there are difficulty penalties for shooting into melee, doing a called shot action, or dodging attacks while in deep snow. That means if you, say, want to make a called shot action to an opponent's head, whose injury chart results often end in instant death, you'll want to stack the deck in every other regard possible. Positioning yourself on higher elevation and as close to the opponent as possible, stunning them first, etc., adding as many positive modifiers to make up for the -20 penalty to the called shot as possible.
This makes position and maneuver an extremely important part of combat. It creates interesting decision points throughout the course of a round that might change what a player is doing in any given turn. Now look back at D&D 5e. The fact that the only modifier a DM can hand out is a static state of advantage or disadvantage means that players have no need to be any more creative than is required to gain that single point of advantage, which can be done by simply getting a flanking bonus. This is the reason why players so often fall into a rhythm of always doing the same action over and over again every round. Spellcasters don't need to reposition, because once an enemy is in melee, they're probably not going to be leaving it for fear of opportunity attacks. This means they have no incentive to ever stop casting whatever spell is the most spell slot efficient and the highest damage, whether it be the Wizard's Fireball or the Warlock's Eldritch Blast. Once in melee, martial classes adopt a brain-dead tank and spank playstyle of just basic attacking with their weapon and occasionally activating a class ability, because there are no incentives for getting out of melee once in it before your target's dead. The idea that this level of rot at the core of D&D 5e's combat loop can be fixed by introducing a fucking chess timer is, to me, laughable. Because the core problem with D&D 5e's combat is not that it takes too long, and it cannot be fixed by having the same series of extremely boring decisions happen faster. The decisions themselves have to be made more interesting. However, we're talking about all this as if it's in a kind of vacuum. Combat as separate from the rest of the game. And I think that's also part of the problem. So to wrap up this discussion, I want to discuss 5e holistically, as an entire game. And as I've been doing throughout this video, I'll also be bringing up examples of games that I think does a lot of what D&D 5e tries to do much better. D&D 5e's combat problems are a microcosm of everything wrong with the rest of the game. I'm sorry. I hate to make videos that are just unproductively shitting on a game I don't like, hence me interjecting a lot of talk of other games I like a lot better to hopefully put a more positive spin on this video. But I also have to be honest. D&D 5e is, in many ways, a mess, because it doesn't know what it wants to be. D&D is a combat-focused game, no doubt, but that doesn't actually tell you much. Lancer is a combat-focused game, so is Shadowrun, so is Werewolf the Apocalypse,
But if you tried to say that these 3 games tried to capture the same play experience, you'd be woefully mistaken. What is D&D 5e trying to portray with its rules? The obvious answer is Lord of the Rings. Specifically, the Fellowship of the Ring. A group of adventurers are marching through the woods to go to a dungeon. On the way, they make camp, they forage for supplies, and they encounter new or temporary allies, as well as unexpected dangers on their quest to save the world. Now, this intuitively makes sense. If you flip over to Part 2, Chapter 8, Adventuring, you get a shocking amount of rules for just traversing the dense and open wilderness between villages and cities. There's rules for how much you have to eat in a day, how long your character can hold their breath underwater, how long it takes to don and doff a suit of armor, exactly how many hours in a long rest has to be spent sleeping, and how much time can be spent on non-strenuous leisure activities, and exactly how many hours of strenuous activity can occur within a long rest before the long rest is broken and they have to start resting again. There are also rules for groups breaking up after an adventure is over, and what you do between adventures, such as working a job or recovering from serious injuries. The game has no rules for what determining that serious injury is, though, har har. It just keeps going. There is so much minutia in this game about the logistics of camping in the woods, and you would think that would be indicative of how the game is meant to be played, but you'd be wrong. Because these rules aren't placed front and center the same way classes or races or combat actions are. They're buried halfway through the book in a part of the book most players don't think they even have to read. This is the consistent issue with D&D 5e. There's no connective tissue between parts of the game's rules. There's all these rules for determining scarcity and managing logistics, but consequences for if that management is done poorly are not properly communicated. These rules are buried in the back of the book and not given anywhere near as much attention or focus as class abilities or how to roll to hit things. And as a result, players typically just ignore them. I have never once been told by a DM that I can only stay underwater for X number of rounds before I enter a drowning state. I've never once been asked during a goblin ambush if I'm going to spend the several rounds of combat it would take for me to put my armor on. And I have never once actually had a DM play out the actual rules for a long rest. I have never once been asked by a DM if I'm voluntarily deciding to go on half rations, or if I have enough rations to eat that day, or applying ranks and exhaustion based on my character's bad habit to forget to eat. Because the rules for exhaustion are buried in the very back of the book, in the appendices, literally telling players the rule is perfunctory. You don't put things in the back of the book that is meant to be required for play. You don't put things in the appendix of a book that is meant to be required for play. If it's a logistics game about managing resources and really deep overland travel mechanics, those should be front and center. Instead, most players just end up abstracting out the vast majority of those rules. The first thing almost every DM does is house rule out things like counting arrows or pounds of rations or feet of rope, because it's this massive cavalcade of kinda esoteric rules buried in the middle of the book, sorted under unassuming subheaders. Meanwhile, character classes and character races are presented with all this beautiful art and big, bold text and flavorful descriptions, so people rightfully assume that that's what the game's about. They look at all this and conclude that D&D is just a combat or social game, is just a game about role-playing as an elf who's got a class that determines how they hit things with a sword. The game's issues with regards to combat
are further exemplified by the fact that the thing that combat is in service to is treated as an afterthought by the game itself. Everything in an RPG should go toward a desired fantasy or play experience. Games are often at their best not when they try to be the best game for every situation, but when they try to be the best game at a specific thing. The ultimate reason why D&D 5e's combat is such a death sentence for the rest of the game is because of its load-bearing nature. It cannot hold up a campaign entirely on its own the way a game that put a lot more effort into making a refined combat system, like Dark Heresy or Lancer, can. And the thing that combat could potentially be in service of is a series of outdoor survival and camping rules which are buried near the back of the book, reference and rely on other rules that are even further back in the book, and which most people outright ignore anyway for being too cumbersome and fiddly. This creates a situation where D&D 5e becomes a game about nothing. It just becomes a mediocre combat engine for generic fantasy adventures. And yeah, that's not something that you can fix with any number of haphazard band-aid solutions to individual rules and nitpicks. So, okay, I've said a ton of times that I don't want this video to just be me unproductively shitting on a game I don't like, so it would probably help for me to actually provide some actionable solutions. Alternative examples are fine enough. I can talk about Lancer, I can talk about Dark Heresy, I can talk about Shadowrun, I can talk about older editions of D&D until the cows come home. So how do I think we fix D&D's combat? You don't. You actually make an effort to use the rest of the rules in the game. Focus more on the survival element. When the players finally leave town to go to the dungeon, don't just say, and then you walk through the woods for 3 days. No, those 3 days could provide some really interesting gameplay experiences. Imagine if, on the second night, the players make camp, and goblins try to sneak into their camp to steal their food. The combat is whatever, it's fine. It's like a dozen goblins, and the players are all around level 5, so the combat itself maybe only takes 4 or 5 rounds. But, oh shit! While we were fighting, the goblins were able to steal 6 pounds of food from the wagons. The group has now just collectively lost 6 days worth of food. And they haven't even gotten to the dungeon yet. If you're actually playing with all of the survival mechanics being used as they're intended, that could actually be really bad. Suddenly, D&D becomes a game about something. It becomes about managing crisis, about the halting of the falling of individual dominoes throughout the process of a spelunk. Nobody, actually does this because D&D tries to all but hide its survival mechanics and puts its combat so front and center, but the rules are there. That is how you fix D&D's combat. It's not by adjusting the combat rules, because the problem with D&D 5e's combat is not the combat itself. The fatal sin of 5e's combat is that it's a mediocre combat engine that is in service to nothing. It essentially exists in a vacuum separate from the rest of the game. But mediocre combat can be made extremely tense and even engaging if that combat is contextualized within a wider play environment. Suddenly, they're not just fighting goblins because it's D&D. You fight goblins in D&D. Instead, you're fighting goblins because, oh fuck, they're gonna take our stuff! The stuff that we need to live! Suddenly, combat's actually really fun, because you're doing it for reasons other than to just get to the next combat encounter. Which is, sadly, how most people play D&D and how most official Wizards of the Coast adventures are written. So, yes, D&D 5e's combat is bad. Yes, other games do what it tries to do better. But the real takeaway is that D&D 5e's combat is bad ultimately because it's only in service to itself. D&D 5e's lackluster combat wouldn't be so much of a problem if the game had meaningful infrastructure for having that combat be for a reason beyond combat's sake, which it technically kinda does. Every individual aspect of a role-playing game ought to contribute to, or at least not impede, a desired fantasy or play experience. Playing Hunter the Reckoning needs to feel like you're a weird cryptozoology-obsessed podcaster who is learning in real time just how correct you really were. Playing Shadowrun needs to feel like playing as an off-the-grid mercenary in an oppressive capitalist hellscape, being paid to do morally dubious things by rich capitalists who don't want their dirty deeds tracked back to them. Everything within the game, the combat, character generation, rolling to perform skill checks, needs to in some way reinforce or at least not impede that unified vision. But D&D 5e has no unified vision. Is it a combat-light fantasy role-playing game about overland survivalism? Is it a combat-heavy fantasy role-playing game about heroic warriors doing battle against great evils? It tries, and ultimately fails, to do both. And what it leaves is a combat system that is neither simple enough to get out of your way, nor is meaningful enough to be fun to engage with. It's not that D&D 5e's combat is bad, per se. It's that D&D 5e's combat inevitably fails to live up to its own goals. Because the only goals they had when designing this combat system is that it needs to be combat. Is it combat that serves to add additional stakes to a survival situation? Is it combat that serves to provide a power fantasy for the player? Is it combat that serves to give meaningfully deep tactical challenges? I don't know. And the game doesn't seem to know either. And that is what's actually wrong with D&D 5e. And explaining it only took... oh god.
Hey, yeah, I'm really sorry this video took so long. I didn't really mean for it to, but I've been, things have been hectic recently. So I had to spend some time away, focusing on other things going on in the world other than making videos, especially because it's Pride Month now. But now that this video is over, I am going to be able to get back on a much more consistent upload schedule, and I just want to thank everyone for their patience with regards to how long this video took. So, with that being said, I want to thank the wonderful patrons who kept supporting me through my little hiatus, and they are Angry Skeleton Pope, Connor Shaver, Henry Michelle, Jamie Harris, Maev, Paul Camagliano, S.J. Klepecki, and then I have 3 $5 patrons. Those are Gabrielle Maggio, Gecko551, and Juno Me. If you would like to join them, there are links in the description to where you can do that, as well as my Discord server if you want to talk to me. There's also social medias and the various games I work on through Sword and Board Games if you want to support me through that. Alright, with that being said, just once again, thank you for watching this video, and have a fantastic rest of your day.